Hello, class. This is Professor Arnie here to talk to you about administrative law. You can tell my voice is better, but it's not 100%. So I apologize for sounding a little bit raspy, but we're going to get through this. Today we're talking about Florida and federal regulations, which is administrative law. Okay. At the end of this class, you're going to be able to tell me how Florida and federal rules or regulations, those terms are used interchangeably, how they're made from the beginning to the end, how they're amended, same process, what the official sources are for them, where to find them, how to cite them, and most importantly, the difference between a statute and a regulation. So here we are. We know statutes come from the legislative branch, and we know court cases come from the judicial branch, and now we're finally talking about this middle executive branch, right? Regulations, also known as rules, and agency decisions or orders. And so agencies have two functions. The first thing is that they set up, or what they call promulgate. They don't enact. Statutes are enacted. Regulations and rules are what they call promulgated. So the agencies promulgate rules that interpret statutes. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. But then they also have tribunals that settle disputes when a citizen has purportedly violated a regulation or a rule. So they make the rules and then they adjudicate the rules. Okay, and then if you don't like the agency decision, you can usually sue and go to court, and you would take it up to the judicial branch. But I get ahead of myself. I don't know what this slide is about. We're moving on. Administrative law. What is administrative law? So it's about the powers and the procedures of agencies, executive agencies. And so those are rules, administrative decisions or orders. We just talked about that. And the administrative agencies are governmental bodies that are authorized to implement the laws. So if you think about what does a congressman, your average congressman, know about environmental protection or what national security or income tax or all of these different things, endangered species, think about that. So they're making laws about these things that are very broad and general, like they have a purpose and sometimes a penalty and that sort of thing, but the actual details, they are not in a place to really provide because they're not experts. Administrative agencies fill that gap. So a regulation will be a much more detailed explanation of the broader provisions that are in a statute. Okay, administrative agencies. You know what these are. You may not realize you know what these are, but you do. So popular or commonly known federal agencies, Homeland Security, Social Security, Patent and Trademark, the SEC, and then Florida's agencies, Florida Department of Education. We also have a Department of Citrus, emergency management, right? Because we have all the hurricanes. Financial services, those are Florida agencies. Basics. Okay. A regulation, also called a rule, I personally prefer to call them in their initial state a rule and their final state a regulation, but you can use, pardon me, as I clear my throat, you can, they are definitely interchangeable terms. So a regulation or a rule is a general statement that is written by an executive branch agency to implement, administer, or enforce the requirements of a statute. They specify the details and requirements. We just talked about that, right? This is kind of a repetitive slide, isn't it? But I'm going to go through it anyway. And the main thing from this slide that you need to know is that the legislature has to authorize an agency to promulgate regulations. Okay? So agencies don't just have free rein to do what they want. They only have the authority that was granted to them by, say in the federal situation would be Congress, through a statute. Okay? So sometimes the legislature in its statute will require the agency to issue a regulation. They will say, SEC, you will issue a regulation to give the details on how this law should be implemented. Sometimes the legislature will give the agency more discretion. It's like, okay, issue regulations that as you see fit. This is a very important point. Regulations have the full force and effect of law, okay? Just as much as a statute does, okay? That's a common question. So remember that. The administrative process. So here are the steps of the administrative process. First, Congress, or the Florida legislature in our case, grants statutory authority. So they create a statute, they enact a statute that gives an agency, a regulatory administrative agency, the power to make a regulation. Then the agency drafts a proposed rule. They publish that proposed rule, and they have a comment period. So they give notice to the public. Here's a proposed rule. And depending on the agency and what have you, usually there's a 30 to 60 day period in which the public gets to make comments on what they think about the rule. And that literally means anyone. Joe Public can make a comment, but frequently it is interested industries that will make comments. So if it's a banking rule, Bank of America is going to have an opinion and make a comment, such and so forth. Then they draft a final rule based largely on the comments. They do take all those comments into account. They publish that final rule, and then ultimately that final rule is codified. So the important thing to know here is that this is, of all three branches of government, this is where the citizens have the most say. So you can elect a congressman, right? You vote, you elect a congressman. Sometimes you even elect judges. And they do their thing. And you can write them letters, saying you agree or disagree, at least congressmen you can, with something that they're preparing to do in Congress or in the legislature, and state your opinion. But this is where, in the administrative process, where they actually solicit the comments from the public, listen to them, take them into account, and adjust from the proposed to the final rule based on them. So this is where the public has the most influence on our laws and regulations. First we're going to do federal, then we're going to do Florida. Federal rulemaking process. So we already went through the steps, but these are just a little more details about how it works federally. We have statutory authority from Congress giving the agency power to make a regulation through what's called an enabling statute, right? So Congress enacts an enabling statute that gives a specific agency the power to make regulations. The agency drafts a proposed rule, and that proposed rule for federal is published in something called the Federal Register, and it's abbreviated FedReg there. Then we have the notice and comment period, and you can find the comments of the public. Not all of them. They will sort of filter out those that are kind of crazy or not really pertinent, but you will find all the comments on regulations.gov. Then they take into consideration those comments and they draft a final rule. They publish the final rule in the Federal Register. And then that rule is codified and published in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you think about it, this is very similar to the way our statutes went, right? So we had public laws being enacted by Congress, right? They were published in the statutes at large, which was like the daily diary, right, of the Congress, right? Everything that got published in a chronological order. That's how the Federal Register is. It's all chronological. So on January 1st, there could be a regulation about taxes and a regulation about criminal procedure and a regulation about environmental protection. They're just chronological, not by subject. But afterward, and we're going to talk about how they're, the time frame of how they're done, but they are codified the way our statutes are codified in the U.S. Code. These regulations are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's when they get divided up into titles that each have a different subject area, just like the U.S. Code. So these processes are very similar. Enabling statute is the first step. Congress gives the power to create the regulations. They can also use an enabling statute to create the agency in the first place, specify their general or limited powers. Then we have the Federal Register. So as I mentioned, it's the daily journal of the federal executive branch, right? The agencies. It's published every business day. And this is where a federal regulation first gets published. It's organized in 4 categories. We have presidential documents. Then we have actual rules or regulations. Then we have the proposed rules. And then we have notices about like hearings and meetings and things like that. So in my opinion, it's out of order, right? Because the proposed rules and the notices should really be 2 and 3. And then the final rules and regulations should be the 4th thing in the book. But what do you want? They're a little bit out of order. What is a notice of proposed rulemaking? Agency is announcing it's either adding to or changing something, amending something that's already in the Code of Federal Regulations. And the proposed text is published, and this is where they solicit public comments about the changes. So there are 2 parts of a proposed rule. The first is the preamble, and that's where the agency explains why it thinks this is necessary, right? It gives any dates of possible hearings. It tells the public how and who to submit a comment to and what the deadline is for those comments. In the headings of an NPRM, so you see Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, that's NPRM, we'll have the name of the agency, the sub-agency that's promulgating the rule, and then the second part, so underneath the preamble, is the actual regulation, the way it's going to read in the Code of Federal Regulations once it gets published there. Okay, so there's 2 parts. The first part is explaining everything and talking about comments and all that. And the second part is, here's what we, word for word, propose be added to the CFR. So it'll give you the regulation title and all of that. It also has a caption that gives you the summary, deadlines. We're going to look at all of this. The final rule also has a preamble. So it has everything that was in that Notice of Proposed Rulemaking preamble. It's going to give you the basis and purpose of the regulation, and it's also going to talk about the comments they received. We got such and such comments from the public, and in response to them, we made such and such changes. It includes the effective date, and it will identify that when it says legal authority, that's the enabling statute. It will identify the legal authority, aka the enabling statute, for issuing the rule. And then it also will have the final text of the actual rule as it will be published in the CFR. Here's where you can find the Federal Register. Obviously, GovInfo, federalregister.gov, regulations.gov. The government websites usually only go back to the mid-90s. ProQuest, a very expensive database, but it is available at most colleges, has it. Hein Online has all of it. So going back to its inception in 1936. And of course, Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg. So if you have this Code of Federal Regulations, kind of the same question is like, well, I have the U.S. Code. Why do I care about the statutes at large, right? So here's the question here. If you have the Code of Federal Regulations, why would you still use the Federal Register? Well, first of all, this is where only place you're going to find the proposed regs, right? So once they don't get published in the Code of Federal Regulations until they're final. So only the final ones actually make it to codification. And there may have been changes based on comments that are not in the final. So if you want to see the way it read when it was first proposed, you have to go to the Federal Register. And attorneys use this to help interpret regulatory intent behind a regulation because it has that great preamble with all the cool information about why the agency thought it needed a rule in the first place or needed to change a rule. So only the Federal Register contains that preamble. The Code of Federal Regulations only has the second part, just the actual wording of the regulation. None of the interesting stuff from the preamble makes it into the code. And obviously, the effective date of a regulation, once it gets in the code, it's obviously effective. So if you want to see the effective date beforehand, you would need to look in the Federal Register. The CFR. This is where the codified versions go. This is where quarterly, it's every year, but different titles are updated quarterly, as you can see on this slide here. So there are 50 titles, aka 50 different subjects in the CFR. The title, it's called titles, just like it was for the U.S. Code for statutes, right? The thing is, it's instead of at the end of a congressional session, which is when the statutes at large get divvied up into subjects and published by subject in the U.S. Code, here with regulations, they do it quarterly. So titles 1 through 16 are revised on January 1st and so on, as you can see. So whether you were to use, say, 2022 or 2023 in your citation would depend on which title. Of course, now we are already after October 1st, so they're all going to be 2023 because all 4 titles have been updated as of October 1st. The CFR has a title and also something called a part number. It's going to tell you the authority, so the enabling statute that gave the agency the authority to make the rule. It's going to give you a history note at the bottom, usually. But either way, wherever you see it, there's a history note that tells you where the final rule is published in the Federal Register. Same as we did with the statutes at large and the U.S. Code, right? There's a history section in the U.S. Code that tells you what statute at large, what public law started in that situation, legislative process that became that law. And then, of course, the text of the actual rule. Here's where we find the CFR. Govinfo.gov is technically the official. But again, we're looking at 1996 to the present, and it's only going to have the updated through those quarterly dates, right? The title, the beginning titles on January 1st and then April 1st, right? So if something was enacted and it's in the Federal Register, but it's after that quarterly date for that title to be updated, it's not going to get updated in the official CFR for another year, right? So we have something called ecfr.gov. It is unofficial, but it is up to date, almost to the day. Sometimes definitely to the day, but within a couple days, it is updated. So we use ecfr, even though it's not official, because that's where we can find out if something has been promulgated since the last time the CFR was updated on its quarterly schedule. And then ProQuest and Hein, Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg. So we're going to trace that federal rule, just so you're sure that you're clear on the steps. This is just an example. First, we have our enabling statute from Congress. So here's an enabling statute. Title 7 of the U.S. Code, Section 2143, which says promulgation of standards, rules, regulations, and orders, state authority. The Secretary shall promulgate standards to govern the humane handling of animals and what have you, right? And then there is another statute that defines an animal. So the agency decides, hey, we've been given authority from Congress. We need to make some real details here. Like, is a bird an animal pursuant to the Animal Welfare Act? If it's not bred for research, blah, 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 right? That's what I'm saying. Regulations get down to the nitty-gritty details, whereas a statute has very broad rules. So it's 34 pages long. It's published in the Federal Register there on February 22nd, 2022. The agency is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service of the USDA. In this case, we're talking about a proposed rule, right? So we have statutory authority, we have a proposed rule, tells you how to submit comments, summarizes it in the preamble, explains the existing regulations, how they came to be, why we need a new rule or a change to the rule, and the text of the proposed rule, including where it's going to fit in the CFR should it become promulgated. Right now it's just in proposed form. We have a public comment period. In the proposed rule, it will tell you 60 days, ending April 25th. In this case, it was extended by 30 days. That's irrelevant to this discussion. And according to the final rule, there were 19,195 comments that were received by that extended deadline. Comments available on regulations.gov. Final rule was published on February 21st in 2023. It's 68 pages long in the Federal Register. It's going to tell you all kinds of stuff in the preamble about how the rule came to be, what it sought to accomplish. It's going to say we got these 19,000 comments, and these were the most important ones, and we actually made some changes based on those comments, tell you the effective date, and provide the actual text that's going to go in the CFR and tell you where in the CFR it's going to wind up. Then it's going to get codified in the CFR. In this case, Title IX of the CFR, Parts